Captain Saburo Sakai pressed his face against the canopy of his Mitsubishi A6M0, squinting through the crystal-clear sky above Tokyo Bay on the morning of November 15, 1944. What he witnessed would forever change aerial warfare in the Pacific Theater. High above, seemingly untouchable, massive silver aircraft moved in perfect formation like celestial leviathans through the stratosphere. These weren't the familiar Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses or consolidated B-24 Liberators that Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to intercepting. These behemoths possessed a wingspan that dwarfed anything previously encountered. Their foreright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines propelling them at altitudes that rendered conventional interceptors helpless spectators to their own nation's bombardment. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented America's most ambitious aviation project, costing more than the Manhattan Project itself. With a service ceiling of 43,000 feet, these strategic bombers operated in atmospheric realms where oxygen masks became survival. Equipment and temperatures plummeted to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Japanese fighter aircraft, designed for Pacific Island hopping campaigns and carrier-based operations, possessed maximum operational ceilings between 32 and 35,000 feet. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa, Japan's most decorated naval aviator, attempted an intercept mission that morning alongside his squadron. His Kawanishi N-1 KJ Shidenkai, considered among Japan's finest fighters, struggled to climb beyond 38,000 feet. The engines wheezed and coughed in the thin atmosphere, losing power as fuel mixture became increasingly inefficient. Meanwhile, the B-29s maintained their steady course at 41,000 feet, their pressurized cabins allowing crews to operate comfortably while Japanese interceptors gasped for sufficient air. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, this altitude advantage provided American bombers with unprecedented strategic capability during the Pacific Campaign. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots proved devastating. These aviators, trained from childhood to embrace Bushido principles and fight to the death, found themselves reduced to impotent observers. Squadron leader Tetsuzo Iwamoto described the sensation as watching silver whales swimming through clouds beyond our reach. The traditional Japanese fighter tactics of close-quarters combat, developed through years of Pacific warfare, became obsolete against an enemy that operated in unreachable atmospheric layers. Ground-based anti-aircraft artillery faced similar limitations. The Type 88 75mm guns, Japan's primary high-altitude defense system, possessed maximum effective ranges of approximately 30,000 feet. The B-29s flew comfortably above this envelope, their bombardiers selecting targets with methodical precision while Japanese gunners fired futile salvos into empty sky. Weather conditions at extreme altitude created additional challenges for potential interceptors. Jet streams at 40,000 feet generated wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, creating turbulence that could destroy aircraft not specifically designed for high-altitude operations. The B-29s, equipped with sophisticated navigation equipment and pressurized compartments, navigated these conditions with relative ease. Captain Sakai recalled the eerie silence that accompanied these high-altitude formations. Traditional dogfights involved the roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, and the screaming of diving aircraft. These encounters provided only the distant whisper of jet streams and the occasional glimpse of vapor trails marking the bomber's passage. The Japanese High Command recognized the technological gap immediately. Emergency meetings convened throughout Tokyo, with aviation engineers desperately seeking solutions to counter this new threat. Proposals ranged from rocket-powered interceptors to ramming attacks by volunteer pilots, but none addressed the fundamental reality. American industrial capacity had produced a weapon system that operated beyond Japan's technological reach. Young pilots like Ensign Kaneyoshi Muto watched their senior officers struggle with this new paradigm. The traditional Japanese emphasis on pilot skill and spiritual determination seemed inadequate against opponents who possessed overwhelming technological advantages. These silver giants represented more than advanced aircraft. They symbolized America's industrial supremacy and Japan's increasingly desperate position in the Pacific War. The appearance of B-29 formations above Japanese airspace marked a turning point in aerial warfare, introducing concepts of strategic bombing that would define military aviation for decades to come. Major General Curtis LeMay observed the intelligence reports flooding into his headquarters at Guam with grim satisfaction during the final weeks of 1944. Japanese interceptor attempts had proven consistently unsuccessful, with enemy fighters unable to reach operational altitudes where B-29 formations conducted their missions. This tactical advantage would reshape the entire Pacific bombing campaign. The technological specifications of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress revealed the extent of American engineering achievement. Each aircraft weighed 60,000 pounds empty, extending to 120,000 pounds when fully loaded with fuel and ordnance. Four Wright R335 of 57 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, drove the massive bombers through atmospheric conditions that challenged the limits of 1940s aviation technology. Flight Lieutenant Shoichi Tsujita attempted multiple intercept missions throughout December 1944, pushing his Nakajima Ki-84 Heiat to its operational limits. The Japanese fighter, considered among the finest aircraft in their arsenal, possessed excellent maneuverability and firepower at medium altitudes. However, at 38,000 feet, the aircraft's performance deteriorated dramatically. Control surfaces became sluggish, engine power decreased significantly, and pilot endurance suffered from oxygen deprivation despite supplemental breathing equipment. Research from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum indicates that only specialized high-altitude aircraft could effectively operate above 40,000 feet during World War II. The physiological challenges facing Japanese pilots proved equally daunting. Without pressurized cockpits, aviators experienced hypoxia, severe cold exposure, and decompression sickness during extended high-altitude operations. Many pilots reported hallucinations, disorientation, and loss of consciousness during attempted intercepts. The human body, regardless of training or determination, cannot function effectively in environments where atmospheric pressure drops below levels necessary for basic survival. Captain Yasuto Kuwahara documented his experiences attempting to intercept B-29 formations over Tokyo. His mission report described engines that coughed like dying men and controls that responded with the sluggishness of frozen machinery. Even when Japanese fighters managed to climb within visual range of the American bombers, their weapons proved ineffective at extreme altitude. Machine gun trajectories became unpredictable, ammunition performance degraded, and aircraft stability deteriorated to dangerous levels. The B-29's defensive armament added another layer of protection. Each Superfortress mounted 10 Browning M250 caliber machine guns in remotely controlled turrets, plus a tail gunner position with twin cannons. These weapons, designed specifically for high-altitude combat, maintained their effectiveness in conditions that rendered Japanese armaments nearly useless. American gunners operated from pressurized compartments, maintaining peak performance while their opponents struggled with basic aircraft control. Ground observers throughout Japan reported the psychological impact of these untouchable formations. Citizens watched silver specks move across clear skies, knowing that destruction would follow but feeling helpless to prevent it. Traditional Japanese beliefs about divine protection and spiritual strength seemed inadequate against enemies who possessed such overwhelming technological superiority. The economic implications became apparent as bombing campaigns intensified. Japanese aircraft production facilities, already struggling with material shortages, received orders to develop high-altitude interceptors capable of reaching 45,000 feet. Engineers proposed radical designs including rocket-powered fighters, ramjet engines, and even balloon-launched interceptors, but none could be produced quickly enough to affect the war's outcome. Lieutenant Colonel Naoshi Kano, commanding officer of the 64th Sentai, implemented desperate tactical modifications. His pilots removed armor plating, unnecessary equipment, and even ammunition to reduce aircraft weight, hoping to gain additional altitude performance. These modifications proved marginally effective but created new vulnerabilities, making Japanese fighters even more fragile during the rare occasions when combat occurred. Weather reconnaissance became crucial for B-29 operations. American meteorologists studied jet stream patterns, atmospheric conditions, and visibility factors to optimize bombing altitudes. The bombers often operated above cloud layers that concealed ground targets from visual confirmation but protected them from Japanese interceptors, operating at lower altitudes. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. B-29 formations demonstrated America's ability to strike any target within the Japanese home islands with virtual impunity. This capability fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific, making Japanese victory increasingly impossible regardless of ground force performance or naval operations. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa convened an emergency conference of Japan's top aviation commanders on January 8, 1945, as reports of successful B-29 missions accumulated with devastating consistency. The Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced tactician faced an unprecedented challenge: developing effective countermeasures against aircraft that operated beyond the reach of conventional interceptors. The meeting included Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack strategy, and Colonel Takeo Tanamizu, commanding officer of Japan's premier fighter squadrons. These veterans of Pacific aerial warfare found themselves confronting technological realities that challenged fundamental assumptions about air combat. Traditional Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized maneuverability, pilot skill, and close-quarters engagement, principles that became irrelevant when enemies operated at unreachable altitudes. Flight Sergeant Saburo Sakai proposed ramming attacks using volunteer pilots who would sacrifice their aircraft and lives to destroy individual B-29s. This kamikaze approach to high-altitude interception represented the logical extension of Japanese military philosophy, but practical considerations rendered such tactics nearly impossible. Pilots attempting ramming attacks at 40,000 feet faced oxygen deprivation, engine failure, and loss of aircraft control before reaching their targets. The Kawanishi Aircraft Company presented plans for the Ki-9-4i, a high-altitude interceptor specifically designed to counter B-29 formations. This proposed aircraft featured a supercharged engine, pressurized cockpit, and extended wingspan optimized for stratospheric operations. However, development timelines extended into 1946, far beyond Japan's ability to affect the war's outcome. Material shortages, particularly high-quality steel and aviation fuel, made mass production impossible even if the design proved successful. Documents from the Japanese Defense Agency archives reveal that over 30 different high-altitude interceptor concepts were proposed between November 1944 and August 1945. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi experimented with unconventional intercept methods, including balloon-launched fighters that would be towed to high altitude before releasing to attack B-29 formations. These desperate measures reflected Japan's technological desperation but proved impractical for operational implementation. Balloon systems proved vulnerable to weather conditions, timing coordination became nearly impossible, and pilots faced significant risks during the launch procedure. The Japanese High Command considered rocket-powered interceptors based on German technology. The Mitsubishi J-8M Shisui, derived from the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, promised revolutionary high-altitude performance. This radical aircraft could theoretically reach 50,000 feet, surpassing B-29 operational ceilings. However, the rocket fuel proved extremely volatile. Flight duration was limited to minutes, and pilot survival rates during testing remained unacceptably low. Ground-based solutions received equal attention but faced similar limitations. Engineers proposed rocket-launched interceptor missiles, essentially piloted bombs that would be fired at B-29 formations from ground installations. These primitive guided weapons lacked sophisticated targeting systems, making accurate intercepts nearly impossible against fast-moving targets at extreme range. Captain Matsuo Hajiri attempted night interceptions using specially modified Nakajima J-1N Gecko fighters equipped with primitive radar systems. These nocturnal hunters showed promise during initial trials, but struggled with the fundamental altitude limitations that plagued all Japanese interceptors. Even when radar operators successfully located B-29 formations, the fighters remained unable to climb high enough for effective engagement. The psychological toll on Japanese pilots intensified as failed intercept attempts accumulated. Squadron morale deteriorated as experienced aviators repeatedly returned from missions having never engaged the enemy. Many pilots reported feelings of helplessness and inadequacy, emotions traditionally considered shameful within Japanese military culture. Industrial espionage efforts focused on obtaining detailed B-29 specifications and operational procedures. Japanese intelligence services attempted to recruit American personnel, analyze captured equipment fragments, and decode intercepted communications regarding bomber tactics. However, security surrounding B-29 operations remained exceptionally tight, limiting the effectiveness of these intelligence-gathering efforts. Training programs adapted to emphasize high-altitude flying techniques, oxygen management, and extreme weather operations. However, Japan's fuel shortages limited flight training hours, creating a contradiction where pilots needed extensive high-altitude experience but lacked the resources to obtain it safely. The strategic situation continued deteriorating as B-29 formations struck targets throughout Japan with increasing frequency and accuracy. Industrial facilities, transportation networks, and urban centers suffered massive damage while Japanese air defenses remained largely ineffective against the silver giants that ruled the stratosphere. General Korechika Anami, Japan's Minister of War, reviewed damage assessments from the March 9 through 10, 1945 bombing of Tokyo with growing alarm. Operation Meeting House had demonstrated the devastating potential of low-altitude B-29 attacks using incendiary weapons, but even more concerning were reports that high-altitude formations continued striking targets with complete impunity across the Japanese archipelago. The tactical evolution of B-29 operations revealed American adaptability and strategic thinking. Initially, superfortresses conducted precision bombing raids at maximum altitude, targeting specific industrial facilities with limited success due to weather conditions and bombing accuracy limitations. However, General Curtis LeMay's decision to implement low-altitude night incendiary attacks created a dual threat that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. Flight Lieutenant Naoshi Kano attempted to intercept a B-29 formation approaching Osaka on March 13, 1945, flying his modified Kawanishi N-1K2J. Shidenkai stripped of all non-essential equipment to maximize altitude performance. Despite these modifications, his aircraft reached only 37,000 feet before engine performance degraded critically. The American bombers maintained their course at 42,000 feet, their vapor trails marking paths of destruction that Japanese interceptors could only observe helplessly. The physiological demands of high-altitude interception created additional challenges for Japanese pilots already weakened by inadequate nutrition due to wartime rationing. Many aviators suffered from malnutrition, affecting their ability to withstand the extreme conditions encountered at stratospheric altitudes. Oxygen equipment, limited by Japan's industrial constraints, often proved unreliable or insufficient for extended high-altitude operations. According to research published by the Naval War College, Japanese pilot training hours decreased by 60% between 1943 and 1945 due to fuel shortages. Squadron leader Shoichi Sujita documented the psychological warfare aspects of B-29 operations in his personal diary. The sight of untouchable enemy aircraft crossing Japanese skies that will demoralize both military personnel and civilian populations. Traditional Japanese concepts of homeland defense became meaningless when enemies could strike any target without fear of effective retaliation. The B-29's technological advantages extended beyond mere altitude capability. Advanced navigation systems, including radar bombing equipment, allowed precise target selection even through cloud cover that would blind conventional bombardiers. Japanese air defense personnel reported formations that seemed to navigate directly to specific targets despite weather conditions that should have prevented accurate bombing. Captain Yasuhiko Kuro attempted experimental intercept tactics using multiple aircraft in coordinated climbing attacks. His strategy involved staggered formations of fighters climbing at maximum performance while others provided navigation assistance and emergency support. However, even these cooperative efforts failed to overcome the fundamental altitude limitations of Japanese aircraft designs. The industrial implications of B-29 operations became increasingly apparent as bombing damage accumulated. Aircraft manufacturing facilities, already struggling with material shortages, received direct attacks that crippled production capabilities. The Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino factory, previously considered immune to bombing due to its inland location, suffered severe damage from high-altitude precision strikes. Radar technology provided early warning of approaching B-29 formations but offered no solution for effective interception. Japanese radar operators could track the bombers' approach routes, altitude, and formation patterns, but this intelligence proved useless when no interceptors could reach operational altitudes. The psychological impact of watching approaching destruction while remaining powerless to prevent it created additional stress for defensive personnel. Anti-aircraft artillery modifications attempted to increase engagement envelopes against high-altitude targets. Engineers proposed rocket-assisted projectiles, improved firing control systems, and concentrated battery deployments, but none could bridge the altitude gap that protected B-29 formations. Even when artillery fire reached appropriate altitudes, the thin atmosphere at 40,000 feet reduced explosive effectiveness and shrapnel dispersion. The strategic bombing campaign's psychological effects extended throughout Japanese society. Civilian populations developed fatalistic attitudes as air raid sirens became daily occurrences. The traditional Japanese belief in ultimate victory through spiritual determination eroded as evidence accumulated of America's overwhelming technological superiority. Weather patterns influenced B-29 operations but rarely provided relief for Japanese defenders. High-altitude jet streams could either assist or hinder bomber formations, but skilled American meteorologists learned to exploit atmospheric conditions that maximized operational advantages while minimizing risks to aircraft and crews. Colonel Takeo Tanamizu assembled Japan's most experienced test pilots at Fusa Airfield on April 2, 1945, for a desperate experimental program aimed at developing effective high-altitude interception techniques. The assembled aviators represented decades of combat experience, but their conventional expertise seemed inadequate against an enemy that operated in previously unexplored atmospheric realms. The Mitsubishi Aircraft Company presented their latest prototype, the A-7M Repu, designed specifically to counter high-altitude bombing threats. This advanced fighter featured a supercharged Mitsubishi HF-43 engine theoretically capable of maintaining performance above 38,000 feet. However, initial test flights revealed persistent problems with engine reliability, fuel consumption, and pilot life support systems at extreme altitudes. Flight testing revealed the complex engineering challenges associated with high-altitude aircraft operations. Lieutenant Commander Sadaaki Akamatsu discovered that conventional aircraft systems failed catastrophically in stratospheric conditions. Hydraulic fluids froze, electrical systems experienced condensation failures, and even basic instruments became unreliable due to pressure variations and temperature extremes. The German Me-163 Comet technology, acquired through Axis cooperation agreements, promised revolutionary intercept capabilities through rocket propulsion. Japanese engineers at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal worked frantically to adapt this technology for domestic production. The resulting Mitsubishi J-8M Shasui incorporated rocket engines capable of reaching 55,000 feet, theoretically surpassing B-29 operational ceilings. Intelligence reports from the Combined Chiefs of Staff archives indicate that Japanese rocket fighter development accelerated dramatically following successful B-29 high-altitude operations. However, rocket fighter testing revealed new categories of operational challenges. Flight Warrant Officer Toyohiko Inuzuka participated in early J-8M trials, experiencing the terrifying reality of rocket-powered flight. The aircraft's fuel supply lasted only minutes, requiring precise timing and exceptional piloting skills to achieve intercept positions. Moreover, the volatile rocket fuel created significant explosion risks during ground handling and flight operations. Strategic considerations influenced Japanese defensive planning as B-29 operations expanded throughout the Pacific theater. Intelligence reports indicated that American forces planned to base superfortresses on newly captured airfields in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and eventually Okinawa. These forward deployment sites would reduce transit distances, allowing increased bomb loads and more frequent missions against Japanese targets. The technological gap between Japanese and American aviation became increasingly apparent through detailed analysis of recovered B-29 components. Pieces of aircraft shot down during low-altitude missions revealed sophisticated engineering solutions that Japanese industry could not replicate. Pressurized cabin systems, advanced turbocharging equipment, and precision manufacturing techniques demonstrated American industrial capabilities that surpassed Japanese production standards. Captain Kaneyoshi Muto led experimental formations using unconventional climbing tactics designed to maximize altitude performance. His technique involved formation flying where multiple aircraft shared the climbing workload, with lead aircraft breaking trail through dense air while following fighters conserved fuel for final intercept attempts. These coordinated efforts achieved marginal improvements but remained insufficient to reach B-29 operational altitudes consistently. Pilot training programs adapted to emphasize extreme altitude operations despite fuel shortages that limited actual flight experience. Ground-based simulation equipment, including altitude chambers and oxygen system trainers, provided essential preparation for high-altitude missions. However, no simulation could adequately prepare pilots for the physiological stress and equipment failures encountered at 40,000 feet. The Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Force coordinated unprecedented cooperation in developing high-altitude intercept capabilities. Traditional service rivalries were set aside as both organizations recognized the existential threat posed by untouchable strategic bombers. Joint training exercises, shared technology development, and coordinated operational planning represented remarkable unity within Japanese military aviation. Weather reconnaissance became crucial for both offensive and defensive operations. Japanese meteorologists studied atmospheric conditions that might force B-29 formations to operate at lower altitudes where conventional interceptors could engage effectively. However, American weather forecasting capabilities, enhanced by Pacific Island observation stations, generally allowed bomber commanders to avoid adverse conditions. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrews intensified as successful intercepts remained extremely rare. Traditional military honors and recognition systems seemed inadequate for missions where success meant simply surviving the attempt to engage an enemy operating beyond reach. Many pilots developed fatalistic attitudes, viewing high-altitude intercept attempts as elaborate suicide missions with minimal probability of achieving meaningful results. Professor Hidemasa Kimura, Japan's leading aeronautical engineer, presented radical aircraft designs to the Imperial Japanese Navy's Aviation Bureau on May 15, 1945, as conventional intercept methods continued failing against high-altitude B-29 formations. His proposals included jet-powered fighters, rocket interceptors, and even piloted missiles designed specifically for suicide attacks against untouchable strategic bombers. The Nakajima Kika, Japan's first jet fighter, represented the most promising technological development for countering high-altitude threats. Based on German Messerschmitt Me-262 designs, this revolutionary aircraft promised superior performance at extreme altitudes where CONVENTIONO piston engines struggled. However, material shortages, particularly rare metals required for jet engine construction, limited prototype development and testing programs. Captain Saburo Sakai volunteered for the most dangerous experimental intercept mission attempted during the Pacific War. His modified Mitsubishi A6M50, stripped of armor and weapons to maximize climbing performance, carried supplemental oxygen supplies and emergency equipment for extended high-altitude operations. The mission required climbing to maximum possible altitude, then gliding toward B-29 formations while attempting to ram individual bombers. Declassified records from the National Security Agency indicate that Japanese desperate measures included proposals for balloon-launched kamikaze attacks against high-altitude bomber formations. The intercept attempt on May 20th demonstrated both Japanese determination and the futility of conventional tactics against advanced strategic bombers. Sakai's aircraft reached 39,000 feet before engine failure forced emergency descent procedures. During his brief time at maximum altitude, he observed B-29 formations operating with comfortable margins above his maximum reach, their crews apparently unaware of his presence far below. Rocket-assisted takeoff systems offered theoretical solutions to the altitude problem by providing additional power during critical climbing phases. The Kawanishi Aircraft Company developed radio units that could boost fighter performance during intercept missions, but these systems proved unreliable and dangerous. Several test pilots died when rocket motors exploded during launch sequences, creating additional safety concerns for already hazardous experimental programs. The Oka flying bomb program represented Japan's most desperate attempt to counter B-29 operations through suicide attacks. These rocket-powered missiles, carried to altitude by modified bombers, were designed to dive at high-altitude targets with sufficient speed to penetrate defensive formations. However, The carrier aircraft remained vulnerable to American fighter escorts, and successful attacks required precise coordination that proved nearly impossible to achieve operationally. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa participated in formation flying experiments designed to create human ladders where multiple aircraft provided climbing assistance to single interceptors. These complex maneuvers involved aircraft flying in close formation while the designated interceptor used their slipstreams to gain additional altitude. The technique showed promise during testing, but proved too dangerous for operational implementation. Industrial priorities shifted dramatically as the high-altitude intercept crisis intensified. Aircraft manufacturers received emergency orders to modify existing designs for improved altitude performance, even if such changes reduced overall effectiveness at conventional altitudes. The Kawasaki Ki-61 underwent extensive modifications including lengthened wings, improved supercharging, and reduced structural weight. Pilot selection criteria evolved to emphasize physical characteristics beneficial for high-altitude operations. Smaller, lighter aviators demonstrated superior performance in oxygen-deprived environments, while pilots with mountaineering experience adapted more quickly to extreme altitude conditions. Traditional Japanese emphasis on spiritual strength required supplementation with scientific understanding of high-altitude physiology. The Fuji T-1 training program incorporated high-altitude flight preparation, despite fuel shortages that severely limited actual flight time. Ground-based training included pressure chamber exercises, oxygen equipment familiarization, and emergency procedure drills for high-altitude equipment failures. However, no amount of ground training could fully prepare pilots for the reality of combat operations at 40,000 feet. Weather warfare concepts emerged as Japanese meteorologists sought natural phenomena that might force B-29 formations into lower altitude operations. Proposals included cloud seeding to create adverse weather conditions, smoke generation to obscure target visibility, and even attempts to predict and exploit jet stream patterns that might hinder American bombing accuracy. The strategic situation deteriorated rapidly as B-29 operations expanded beyond industrial targets to include systematic destruction of Japanese urban centers. The March 9-10 Tokyo firebombing demonstrated that altitude advantages applied equally to incendiary attacks and precision bombing, making civilian populations as vulnerable as military installations to untouchable aerial assault. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, founder of the Kamikaze Special Attack Units, convened a secret meeting at the Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry on June 25, 1945, to discuss the most extreme measures yet proposed for countering B-29 strategic bombing operations. The assembled officers included Japan's most experienced aviation commanders, all recognizing that conventional intercept methods had failed completely against high-altitude American formations. The meeting's agenda included proposals that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Mass kamikaze attacks using specially modified aircraft designed solely for ramming high-altitude bombers, piloted missiles launched from ground installations, and even human-guided rockets that would sacrifice pilots to destroy single B-29s. These desperate measures reflected Japan's deteriorating strategic position and the psychological impact of helplessly watching enemy aircraft devastate the homeland. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi presented intelligence gathered from captured B-29 crew members regarding American operational procedures and aircraft vulnerabilities. The interrogations revealed that Superfortress crews remained largely unaware of Japanese intercept attempts, operating with confidence born from months of virtually unopposed missions. This psychological advantage multiplied the strategic impact of high-altitude bombing beyond mere physical destruction. According to strategic bombing survey records, Japanese air defenses achieved intercept rates below 2% against high-altitude B-29 formations throughout 1945. The Kawanishi N-1KJ Shidenkai received emergency modifications aimed at achieving breakthrough altitude performance through extreme weight reduction and engine modifications. Chief Test Pilot Saburo Sakai supervised removal of all armor plating, reduction of ammunition loads to absolute minimums, and installation of experimental oxygen systems that extended pilot endurance at extreme altitudes. These modifications created aircraft that were barely controllable but theoretically capable of reaching 41,000 feet. Experimental ramming tactics developed by Commander Yasuna Kizono emphasized precision timing and formation coordination. His concept involved multiple interceptors climbing simultaneously toward B-29 formations, with pilots calculating intercept courses that would maximize collision probability while minimizing warning time for American defensive responses. The mathematics of high-altitude ramming proved complex, requiring split-second timing in atmospheric conditions that challenged human survival. The Nakajima Tenzin torpedo bomber received modifications for an unprecedented suicide mission against B-29 airfields on Guam and Saipan. These ultra-long-range attacks would strike American bombers on the ground, potentially eliminating entire squadrons before they could participate in strategic bombing campaigns. However, the distances involved exceeded normal operational ranges, requiring one-way missions with no possibility of crew survival. Japanese radar technology achieved significant improvements during this period, with operators learning to track high-altitude formations with increasing accuracy. The Tachi-21 radar system provided early warning of approaching B-29s up to 100 miles from Japanese coastlines. But this intelligence remained tactically useless without interceptors capable of reaching engagement altitudes. Pilot training evolved to include survival techniques for high-altitude combat environments. Flight surgeons developed oxygen management protocols, cold weather survival procedures, and emergency bailout techniques for aircraft operating at extreme altitudes. However, training remained theoretical due to fuel shortages that prevented extensive high-altitude flight experience. The German rocket fighter technology transfer accelerated as Japanese engineers recognized its potential for high-altitude interception. The Mitsubishi J-8 and Shusui program received maximum priority funding and resources, with prototypes scheduled for operational testing by August 1945. This timeline proved tragically optimistic given Japan's deteriorating industrial capacity and material shortages. Strategic deception operations attempted to convince American commanders that effective high-altitude interceptors were under development. False intelligence suggested that Japanese rocket fighters were already operational, hoping to force B-29 formations into less advantageous bombing altitudes. However, American intelligence analysts correctly assessed that no effective Japanese countermeasures existed. Weather modification experiments reached desperate extremes as scientists proposed using high-altitude explosions to disrupt jet streams and create atmospheric disturbances that might affect B-29 operations. These theoretical concepts lacked practical implementation methods but demonstrated the lengths to which Japanese planners would consider going to counter high-altitude bombing threats. The psychological toll on Japanese military leadership became apparent as repeated failures to develop effective countermeasures eroded confidence in ultimate victory. Traditional Japanese military philosophy emphasized spiritual strength over technological superiority. But the B-29 threat demonstrated conclusively that advanced engineering could overcome determination and courage through sheer operational impossibility. Emperor Hirohito received his final briefing on high-altitude air defense capabilities on August 6, 1945, the same morning that Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted the Enola Gay toward Hiroshima at 31,000 feet. The irony proved profound. While Japanese engineers had spent months developing interceptors for 40,000-foot operations, the atomic bomb was delivered at an altitude well within conventional fighter range, yet no effective defense existed. The strategic implications of Japan's failure to counter high-altitude B-29 operations became clear in the war's final weeks. American industrial capacity had produced weapon systems that operated beyond Japanese technological reach, fundamentally altering the balance of Pacific warfare. Traditional concepts of homeland defense, based on intercepting enemy aircraft through superior pilot skill and determination, proved obsolete against adversaries possessing overwhelming technological advantages. Flight Lieutenant Saburo Sakai made his final intercept attempt on August 9th, climbing toward a lone B-29 approaching Kakura in his experimental high-altitude A-6M known to him. The aircraft carried the second atomic weapon, later dropped on Nagasaki when cloud cover obscured the primary target. His modified Zero reached 38,500 feet before engine failure forced emergency descent, marking the highest altitude achieved by a Japanese interceptor during the war. The psychological warfare aspects of high-altitude bombing proved as devastating as physical destruction. Japanese civilian populations developed fatalistic attitudes as air raid sirens became meaningless warnings of unstoppable attacks. The sight of silver B-29 formations crossing clear skies with complete impunity demonstrated American technological supremacy more effectively than any propaganda campaign could achieve. Post-war analysis by the Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that Japanese high-altitude air defenses never achieved meaningful effectiveness against B-29 strategic bombing operations. Colonel Curtis LeMay's tactical evolution from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks revealed the flexibility of American strategic planning. When weather conditions and bombing accuracy limitations reduced the effectiveness of high-altitude operations, B-29 formations could adapt to alternative tactics while maintaining their fundamental invulnerability to Japanese interceptors. Through superior technology and operational planning, the technological legacy of Japan's desperate high-altitude interceptor development influenced post-war aviation development, jet engine research, rocket propulsion experiments, and high-altitude life support systems contributed to later commercial and military aviation advances. However, these innovations came too late to affect the Pacific War's outcome or prevent Japan's surrender. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reflected on the strategic implications of altitude-based aerial supremacy in his post-war writings. The same nation that had achieved tactical surprise through innovative carrier aviation found itself helpless against enemies who possessed superior high-altitude capabilities. This reversal demonstrated how rapidly technological advantages could shift during modern warfare. The human cost of Japan's failed high-altitude intercept program included dozens of test pilots killed during experimental missions, scores of aircrew lost attempting impossible intercepts, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed in futile climbing attempts. These losses, while statistically small compared to overall Pacific War casualties, represented the elite of Japanese military aviation sacrifice to counter an insurmountable technological challenge. Japanese industrial efforts to develop effective high-altitude interceptors continued literally until the war's final days. On August 14, 1945, hours before Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, engineers at the Kawanishi factory were still testing modifications to improve fighter altitude performance. Their dedication highlighted both Japanese determination and the impossibility of overcoming American technological superiority through willpower alone. The B-29 Superfortress operations against Japan established precedents for strategic bombing that influenced military doctrine throughout the Cold War era. The concept of aircraft operating beyond enemy intercept capabilities became fundamental to nuclear deterrence strategies, while the psychological impact of unstoppable aerial attacks shaped civilian defense planning worldwide. As silver contrails faded from Japanese skies on August 15, 1945, they left behind a transformed understanding of aerial warfare. The age of untouchable high-altitude strategic bombers had begun, forever changing the relationship between technology, altitude, and military power. Japanese pilots had witnessed the future of warfare from far below. Unable to reach the atmospheric realms where their nation's fate was ultimately decided by enemies flying beyond their grasp in